The Great War was, at the time, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. And although it would be dwarfed by the Second World War, which would come 20 years later, the millions of lives that were changed through this conflict hopefully will never be forgotten. And I wanted to take a look at this video today, The Loss of Life in World War I Visualized. This was recommended by a viewer. Thank you very much, Tysoon. And one of the most popular videos on this channel is the fallen of World War II. And I think that it's an important video because having a visualization of these numbers is really important to sort of understand the magnitude and to understand how many lives were lost in these conflicts. So I wanted to check this one out. This one is not done by the same channel that did the fallen of World War II. This is RealLifeLore, though it's very clearly inspired by that video. And the style of it is really quite similar. So let's have a look at this one. If you haven't already yet, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Without further ado, let's get into it.
I purposefully released this video on the 9th of November 2018. 2 days from now, on the 11th of November, will mark exactly 100 years since the end of the First World War, one of the most destructive and violent wars ever fought in human history. While the Second World War and the destruction it caused often overshadow the First World War, I felt like now would be a good time to remember and visualize the enormous loss of life that the Great War caused. We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately, as well as deaths and injuries separately. A casualty can be a confusing statistic in war because it means that a soldier has been taken out of action, but not necessarily killed. Each of these models represents 1,000 people who died or went missing, while each of these models represents 1,000 people who were injured, which when combined equal the number of casualties.
And one thing that's important to note here is that an injury can stem from something like, being shot through the arm for example, which is obviously a pretty devastating injury, but is not life-threatening, or could be something like, having to have an amputation, right? Which is obviously completely life-changing if you are, if you become disabled in that manner and you don't have, one of your limbs anymore. So that's just important to note, is that an injury can be it can be varied, and they all equal up to casualties.
And we'll begin the counting with the United States. Over 116,000 soldiers died, and another 204,000 were injured fighting against the Germans and Austrians on the Western Front. This amounted to 0.17% of the American population at the time becoming a casualty of war. But America only fought for a little over a year between 1917 and 1918. The war had already been going on for over 2.5 years before that. So let's take a look at some of the countries who were fighting from the beginning.
Let's talk about this quickly. So it's not really fair to say they were fighting from 1917 till 1918. That's not really true. The United States does join the war in 1917, but they actually don't send troops over to Europe because it takes time to mobilize until 1918. And if I remember correctly, it wasn't really until the summer of 1918, up until the fall of 1918, where the war ends in November, obviously, that America is actually involved in some of the larger battles and takes a lot of those casualties. What's also I think is important to note is that though, as it said there, they took over 100,000 casualties, what's interesting is that in World War II that they were involved in from 1941 to 1945, as well as in the Pacific theater, they took 450,000 casualties. So that just sort of goes to show the amount of destruction and death that this Great War caused, and that in such a shorter period amount of time, they took a quarter of the amount of casualties.
The war began when Austria-Hungary declared war against Serbia in 1914, and Serbia suffered worse than any other country during the war. 375,000 Serb soldiers lost their lives in the fighting, while another 625,000 civilians died from famine and disease. That amounted to over 22% of the Serbian population dying during the 4-year-long war. More than 1 out of every 5 people in the country. Serbia was a member of one of the 2 alliances that fought against one another in the war called the Entente, which also included the United Kingdom, France, Russia, Italy, America, and many others.
Let's take that in for a second. 1/5 of the population of Serbia was killed. I actually did not know it was that high. I knew that Serbia lost a lot of their troops, and they fought incredibly bravely. They were not, Austria-Hungary was not able to actually conquer Serbia, despite the fact that Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, starting World War I overall. But God, 1/5 of your population, that is devastating. That's a lost generation. Wow.
All of whom would suffer terribly. The United Kingdom would send over 815,000 soldiers to their graves, like on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, in which 19,000 would die in only 24 hours, the bloodiest single day in British history. Over 123,000 British civilians also lost their lives during the war, totaling up to just over 2% of the British population, or about 1 in every 50 people dying. But many more were wounded. 1,675,000 more soldiers, which adds together to 5.77% of the UK population then, becoming casualties of the war, subjects of the British Empire.
What's even sad too is that a lot of those wounded men, they would return to the home front to really have nothing for them. By the end of the war, Britain was practically bankrupt. They had loads of debt, there was a problem with inflation, and a lot of these men coming home, they didn't really have the work to return to that they had before. And so it wasn't that once they were wounded and they were back home, all good to go. There was still a lot of suffering after that too.
Like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, and South Africa also fought in the war and took high casualties. Percentage-wise, New Zealand suffered the worst, losing 3.8% of her population as wartime casualties, while numbers-wise, Australia took the hardest hit, losing over 61,000 of her soldiers and suffering another 152,000 wounded, with Canada and India both not too far behind. But the other major Entente powers lost an incredible amount more. The Italians joined the war in 1915, but in 3 years of fighting suffered 555,000 military fatalities, along with 592,000 civilian deaths. Another 947,000 Italian soldiers became wounded, representing 5.8% of the Italian population becoming casualties, a figure roughly comparable to the UK percentage. But then there's Russia.
So let's talk about Italy for a little bit. So there was a total of 12 offenses along the Isona, I'm sorry if I'm going to screw that up, Isona River. And a lot of these casualties fall at the hands of Luigi Cadorna. He was the chief of staff of the Italian army. And to say that he is looked upon negatively in history is a massive understatement. He was incredibly inflexible. He didn't care about casualties at all. And he even brought back, well, he didn't bring back, but he had talked about bringing back the Roman concept of, I think it's decimation or something, this where every 10th man is killed for his punishment. And the fact is that the Italians were just constantly assaulting this one part against the Austro-Hungarians and were taking huge amount of casualties. If I remember correctly, Cadorna has 250 to 300,000 casualties on his hands alone. And while every general in the First World War, no matter what side, has those casualties on his hands, it was due to his inflexibility and his inability to really innovate that so many Italians were led to their deaths under him.
And France, both of whom suffered higher casualties than the entire Serbian population combined during the war.
Yeah.
Russia was the first country to come to Serbia's defense during the war and suffered catastrophic losses. 1,977,000 soldiers died fighting against the Central Powers, while another 1,140,000 civilians lost their lives. But Russia suffered vastly higher injuries. 4,350,000 soldiers were wounded during the fighting, which together represents 2.5% of the Russian population that became casualties. These enormous losses eventually helped contribute to Russia's spiral into revolution and their surrender in the war early into 1917. But percentage-wise, the Allied country that suffered during the war the most, besides Serbia, was France. Most of the Western Front took place in northeast.
So let's talk about Russia briefly. So not only that, you got to think about Russia at this point, right? So they overthrow the Tsar, and then they go into the Russian Revolution that's followed by the Civil War, in which hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million or more Russians also lose their lives. Then you follow that up with the Stalinistic terrors, in which millions of Russians were either killed, imprisoned, or sent to work camps. And so within this, 2 generations or so of Russians, it's just nothing but brutality and loss of life, right? And after the Stalinist terrors, there's the Second World War, the deadliest conflict in human history. The amount of suffering at the hands of the Russian people is just, it's hard to comprehend at times.
France and Belgium enduring 4 years of fighting. 1,377,000 French soldiers gave up their lives in defense of their country, along with 340,000 civilian fatalities. This represented a loss of life for 4.3% of the entire French population, but many, many more were wounded. 4,266,000 additional French soldiers were wounded or maimed by the war, representing a total casualty amount similar to Russia's, but from a much smaller population. In total, around 15% of France's population became a casualty during the First World War. A horrible loss of life that wouldn't be fully recovered 20 years later at the start of the Second World War. Other Entente countries in order of wartime casualties.
Again, I didn't know it was that high, but I knew that France had a very difficult time post the First World War due to this amount of population loss. They were one of the struggling economies because they just simply didn't have the workers. So 15% of your population, 15%. Imagine that nowadays. Imagine if in the United States, for example, right, almost 45 million people were killed. That's insane.
Include Romania.
I mean, that's almost, with that amount of casualties, that's like more than 10% of the Canadian population.
Which also suffered terribly at 10.4% of their population becoming casualties, as well as Greece, Belgium,
Romania too,
Portugal, Montenegro, and Japan, with only about 1,000 casualties during the entire war. But now let's take a look at the other side, the Central Powers, which were led by Germany. Germany was fighting on 2 fronts for most of the war and also suffered cataclysmic losses. 2,037,000 of her soldiers died fighting in the west and the east, and 594,000 of her civilians died largely due to starvation caused by the Allied blockade of the country. Another 2.5 million German soldiers were wounded during the course of the war, amounting to 7.8% of Germany's population becoming a casualty, while Germany suffered the highest
I'd say 15 there for a second. Okay.
raw numbers of the Central Powers casualties. She didn't suffer the highest percentage-wise. While Austria-Hungary took less casualties overall, they represented a higher proportion of that empire's population, 10.77%. Over 1.3 million soldiers were killed and another 3.6 million injured, all of which helps to explain why the Austro-Hungarian Empire itself wasn't able to survive the war. But the worst suffering on the Central...
and the Austro-Hungarian Empire ripped itself apart after this. There was no more, and it was basically broken up into the multiple states. There was the creation of Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. There was territory adjustments. Some was given to Romania, Poland, and then Austria itself, obviously. So
power side occurred inside of the Ottoman Empire, and most of it was self-inflicted. The Ottomans joined the war in 1915 and suffered 548,000 military fatalities, and another 582,000 wounded fighting against mostly the British, French, and the Russians. But absurdly high civilian deaths inside of the Ottoman Empire were largely due to the Ottoman government's policy of ethnic cleansing against her Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian ethnic minorities. Collectively known as the Armenian Genocide, 1.5 million Armenians were systematically killed by the Ottoman government during and shortly after the war, along with 600,000 Greeks and 225,000 Assyrians. Accounting for all of this in addition to the military casualties, an enormous 17% of the Ottoman Empire's population was killed or wounded during the conflict, which can also help to explain why this empire too didn't survive long after the war was over. And finally, Bulgaria.
And the Armenian Genocide, I've seen a map of the population of Armenia pre the Armenian Genocide and then post as well, and it's just an absolute shame. You see these, these dark red dots to represent the population before, and then for the population afterwards, they're just this light shade of pink. because you can just see how much population was lost. 1.5 million. Think about that, really.
Was another member of this alliance that suffered greatly as well, with 6.8% of their population becoming casualty victims of the Great War. In total, and across all countries, about 9 million soldiers lost their lives, as well as 7 million civilians. 36% of all deaths were Entente military, 22% were the Central Powers military, another 22% were Central Powers civilians, and the final 20% were Entente civilians. The First World War was, and still remains, the bloodiest war ever fought in the history of the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Belgium, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Turkey, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. The Second World War was actually not as bad for all of these mentioned countries, but it would be worse for others like Russia and Germany.
Yes.
Hopefully, after 2 terrible lessons during the 20th century, humanity will never forget what can happen when we let our differences get the better of us. Lessons of any kind are valuable for both societies and for individuals. And if you made it all the way through this video to here, it's clear that you enjoy learning. So why not learn even more about anything you want to by going over to Skillshare.
Nice. Yeah, so just think about this, right? And this was only then followed up in 1919 when all the armistice was signed, 20 years later, by the Second World War. I can't remember the man who said it initially, but he said, this is not peace, this is an armistice for 20 years. And he said that in 1919, and he was completely correct. So I hope you enjoyed watching that. I think it's important to look at these videos. It's important to understand them and to share them as well, and to say, look at how much we've lost, and let's never get to that point again. As of the date of recording this, we have the conflict that's still going on in Ukraine, and we just hope to have peace in Europe. That's all we want. Thank you very much for joining me on this video. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Let's continue the discussion down there. Take care. All the best. Till the next one.